this day celebrates the signing of the convention, or the opening of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this was one of the 3 major conventions open for signature at the Rio Conference in 1992. The other 2 being the Climate Change Convention and the Land Degradation and Desertification Convention. Now, as many of you all know, the Climate Change Convention has basically taken on a life of its own and has basically outstripped the other 2 in prominence. But what the practitioners know is that you can't have one without the other. Strong ecosystems, good land management practices, what help communities and society battle against the vagaries of global climate change, for example. Intact coral reefs protect the coastlines from battering of waves and sea level rise. Forests and proper agricultural practices prevent desertification and loss of topsoil. So the 3 conventions were all equally important, and what we are trying to do at the community level is bring awareness to the importance of the other 2 conventions in addition to the Climate Change Convention. And one of the ways to do this is to bring home to the average citizen the importance of biodiversity. If you ask the average person what biodiversity is, they may not be able to tell you. But if you link it to something as important as food security, then they will be able to understand and see where they fit in the picture. So today we've asked Dr. Patrick Chesney. I was going to embarrass him and do a formal introduction, but I'll forego that. Dr. Chesney has joined us at the Secretariat as a consultant with the ACP MEA's project, which focuses mainly on the biodiversity conventions. We've lost the project coordinator as of December 2017, and Dr. Chesney joined us late last month in April, so he's hit the ground running, and he brings with him a wealth of experience and expertise in many areas covered under the Biodiversity Convention. So without further delay, I would invite Dr. Chesney to do his presentation. Thanks.
The outline of the presentation follows definition of terms and concepts. I'll share a little bit about the convention itself, some things about the role of the Caribbean community in driving the process of biodiversity conservation that you may or may not know. We'll examine the relationship between biodiversity and food and nutrition security. What exactly is the situation with respect to food and nutrition security in the Caribbean, and what opportunities biodiversity provide in securing food and nutrition security for all. In terms of terms and concepts, biological diversity, think of it as the totality of life on Earth. It is that variability among all the various forms of life and how they relate to one another. It's that diversity that drives life on Earth. And when they come together, interacting with the non-biological aspects of nature, they form ecosystems. And these can be natural ecosystems or man-made ecosystems. So peri-urban and urban communities can also be classified as ecosystems as long as you have this interaction between biological and non-biological forms. And then there's the ecoregion. It's a much larger unit than the ecosystem. Think of it as an assemblage of ecosystems that follow the original extent of natural communities prior to major land use change. Now, biodiversity becomes important because it's been threatened by a number of factors. And so conservation studies the loss of that biodiversity and the ways in which this loss can be prevented. And we can think of conservation in the natural habitats, so that's in situ conservation, or we can think about conservation away from natural habitats, ex situ conservation. In the literature, you will find arguments in favor of using the ecoregion approach to conserving biodiversity. And we've had a number of major publications, for example, Olson et al. In 2001 mapped 846 terrestrial ecosystems on planet Earth. And this was followed in 2007 with the mapping of 232 marine ecoregions. Recently, as last year, an Oxford group did an evaluation of the Aichi targets and utilized an ecoregion approach to doing so. We'll examine why this approach is important. But the use of the ecosystem approach is by default. It's mandated in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So all parties to that convention must follow the ecosystem approach to conserving biodiversity. Food and nutrition security defines the condition in which all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And there is a relationship between food safety and nutrition, which I think is well known to all. Here are some new concepts for some of you. Biocapacity represents the productivity of the ecological assets. In other words, it's the capacity of Earth to renew itself. So those renewable features of Earth is the capacity of those features to renew. And then we have the ecological footprint, which is actually the demand on the biocapacity. It's measured as ecological footprint, and both are reported in terms of global hectares. And you will see later on we use GHA to mean global hectares and global hectares per person when we look at the per capita biocapacity or the demand on that biocapacity. If I'm going too fast, just slow me down. About the convention itself, we heard from Ms. Singh that the CBD entered into force in 1993. And there are three main objectives. One, the conservation of biological diversity, also referred to as biodiversity in short. The sustainable use of the components of that biodiversity. And fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of that biodiversity. So these are the three primary objectives of the convention. And it's the implementation of activities to achieve these that have kept us awake at nights for the past 25 years. Now the parties that to the convention have signed on and have obligations. You've heard a lot about the national biodiversity strategies and action plans at the national level. And you've certainly heard about the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were set in Hyderabad, India in 2010. And these action plans at a country level reflect how a country intends to fulfill the objectives of the convention and the concrete action it intends to take. And then there are these strategic goals that are part of the biodiversity strategic plan at the global level. Importantly, we need to address what drives the biodiversity loss. How can we reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use? How can we improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems? And you need to understand something. Biodiversity underpins ecosystems. If we take away biodiversity, we can take away ecosystems functioning and human well-being. That's the link. It's an organic link. We need to enhance the benefits of all biodiversity goods and services so that human beings can enjoy their utility. And we need to enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. Now all 15 member countries of the Caribbean community are endowed with a rich and globally unique biodiversity. Latin American Caribbean is considered a biodiversity superpower. However, the biodiversity in the Caribbean is under severe and increasing threat. In fact, the Caribbean islands have been identified as one of the world's top biodiversity hotspots. A hotspot is an area characterized by both a high level of regionally unique species and a severe degree of the loss of the habitat where they can be found. And if we examine the IUCN Red List, we'll find a large number of species. There are about 100 species that are on that red list from CARICOM member countries. It's important too that we understand where these member countries are located. There are some on mainland South America. For example, Belize is included in the Mesoamerica biodiversity hotspot. Guyana and Suriname are part of the Guyana Shield, which is a very important ecoregion. And the next slide will show exactly where these are found. Here, for example, the Caribbean islands in an area known as the Caribbean Large Marine Ecosystem. There's another large ecosystem in the marine space known as the North Brazilian Shelf, which brings all the nutrient-rich waters from the Amazon plume all the way up to meet with the Caribbean waters outside of Venezuela and Trinidad. This is a huge area, 4.4 million square kilometers. And then we have the Guyana Shield, which is a subset of the Amazon biome. They're one of three what we call tectonically stable plates in the Amazon Shield, and that's why there are no earthquakes. It's very stable, and the Guyana Shield in particular is very old. It's 2 billion years old. So there are species there that are very only common to that area. We call those species endemic. Now, the Caribbean has a history of punching above its weight. So when the convention entered into force in 1993 on the 29th of December, 5 Caribbean countries were part of that, made that happen. And they are listed here: Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia. They helped to bring about this very important outcome. And then we went one step further. The Bahamas hosted the very first Conference of Parties in 1994. And therefore formed that very important body of work that resulted in COP1 documents that are available to all on this website here. I suspect that the hosting of this meeting in Bahamas had a lot to do with a person on the next slide, which you had a peek of, Angela Cropper. At that time, she was the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat from 1993 to 1995. And this very iconic Caribbean woman from Trinidad has done a lot of great things, and the entire world mourned her passing in 2012. And as you can see, she spent some time working at the CARICOM Secretariat. But it didn't end there in terms of Caribbean's contribution. A collective of parties to the convention and others, 7 full CBD parties to the convention, formed an alliance known as the Caribbean Challenge Initiative and made a pledge that in each participating country and territory that they will effectively conserve and manage at least 20% of marine and coastal environment by 2020. And at that time they had mobilized $75 million US. This is one of 10 pledges that were made since 2010. And these pledges, and those who make the pledges, are known as biodiversity champions, recognized by the Secretariat of the Convention, and provide a number of categories of services Provisioning services, including food, water, fuel, and fiber, for example. Regulating services like carbon sequestration, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in trees. That's a regulating service, it's a climate regulating function. Cultural services, and then we have the supporting services. All of these are very essential to human well-being and poverty eradication. However, there are a number of processes, direct and indirect, that are driving a change to biodiversity, resulting in biodiversity loss towards extinction, perhaps for some species. And this is very important to all humankind. It is the duty of everyone to ensure that we are contributing to the conservation of biodiversity so that we may continue enjoying these services that are important to our well-being. It is of concern because so far we have been able to identify a large number of ecosystems and habitats that have been destroyed by man through wars and civil issues between countries, through land use change, for example, in Guyana and in many other countries that have large amounts of mineral resources. Mineral mining is driving deforestation, and with that destroying habitats for wildlife, which is so important to the maintenance of ecosystem health. Many rural communities use that biodiversity as an insurance and coping mechanism to increase flexibility and spread or reduce risk in the face of increasing uncertainty, shocks, and surprises. In many indigenous and maroon communities in the region, you'll often hear those communities defining the forest or an area of nature as their supermarket. That's where they can go and obtain almost all of their renewable supplies, and they don't need to go far away to acquire those. There's some encouraging trends around the world. For example, food provision has grown faster than overall population growth, so there is an adequate amount of food. The issue is the distribution of the food. Same thing with livestock. However, we have seen around the world that marine fish harvest is declining, as well as the provision of food sources from wild relatives of plants, or from wild harvesting of plants and animals. That is decreasing, and that is worrisome. It suggests that the world food supply is concentrated on a very narrow range of crops and livestock. Here's a concept that is relatively recent, but fundamental to understanding the importance of biodiversity. The Global Footprint Network has introduced a concept called the Ecological Footprint that basically measures how fast we consume the resources of the earth and we generate waste. And generating waste is important. We tend to forget that aspect. And when we talk about production and consumption, we forget the element of waste. So how fast we consume the resources compared to how fast nature can replenish those resources and consume the waste that we humans generate. The United Nations utilized this concept and combine it with its Human Development Index, which basically measures the wealth of nations and how well human beings are progressing. A high Human Development Index is 0.7, so anything above that is good. However, what we have on this axis here is the ecological footprint, otherwise known as the demand on nature, all right, as measured by global hectares. What we have seen is the trend, the conventional belief that countries that are developing and that have achieved development, they have done that at a high cost to nature. And these are countries in the developed world. But look carefully at Latin America and the Caribbean. They are following that global trend. Yeah? And this will come home to you in a short while. And then there is this sustainable path, where you can achieve high human development, but at low cost to the environment. In other words, your policies, laws, strategies, programs, and plans follow a green path to development. There's only one country in the region that's in this quadrant, and that's Cuba. It has achieved high human development, but at low cost to nature. I hope you can see the text in the red field. But what I've done here is to separate out what we can refer to as the biodiversity creditor nations, or the biocapacity creditor nations, the ones that have high amounts of nature remaining within their jurisdiction. And those in red are the ones that have less. Okay? Now, the global average is 1.7 global hectares per person. Each person on planet Earth has 1.7 global hectares to, in other words, to harvest all that you need. Food, fiber, fish, whatever. But the demand that we are placing on nature outstrips what nature can provide. So there's a deficit, yeah, of 0.9. And that should be a negative value. So that's my fault. Well, we have 3 countries that are above not only the Latin American Caribbean average, but the global average. Suriname, the 2nd greenest country on Earth, and Guyana, the 3rd greenest country on Earth. And they have relatively low, but low in comparison to the capacity, ecological footprint. And look over here in this column. There is a high biocapacity reserve. Now these countries can actually support a larger population than they currently have. The story here is not so. These countries listed here no longer have the facility of nature to provide for their needs, and so must rely on imports to meet those needs. And that's a troubling situation. Here I show, for example, from the Global Footprint Network website, these graphs that basically help you to visualize in the green areas what's available for human use. But they're all showing a declining trend, which is normal, because you have to use nature to meet your needs. But it's how fast you use it and how fast nature can replenish itself. And some interesting information as well on the contribution of agriculture to GDP, the contribution of tourism to GDP, and we will make those links a bit later, as well as the per capita GDP. Here it's all red to indicate that these countries no longer have nature at their disposal to meet human demands. Now, if a population's ecological footprint exceeds the biocapacity, then we create a deficit, known as an ecological deficit. Yeah? And so the demand for goods and services that the land and seas can provide, such as fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, wood, cotton, for example, they exceed what the region's ecosystems can renew. And so a country in deficit meets the demand by importing or liquidating its own ecological assets. So having to fish out of season, for example, resulting in depletion of stocks, or emitting more carbon to the atmosphere. However, the obverse is true. When the biocapacity exceeds the footprint, then you have an ecological reserve. And so that's how we can talk about creditor nations and debtor nations when it comes to nature. Now, what's the food situation like? And here I draw from work done by FAO and reported in 2015. We can see that in CARICOM, the contribution of agriculture to GDP is declining. Sorry about that. I'm trying to get the pointer to work, but it was acting up before. Yeah. So we see that that is declining. At the top there, the curve you can see is a downward trend. And next, below that, you can see that food imports have been skyrocketing. It's now approaching, it's on the wrong side of $4 billion per year. And most CARICOM countries are net importers of food. Yeah? And as we can see from the FAO study, 80% of available food in the CARICOM Caribbean is from imports. And below that at the bottom, it shows, and you can't see the slide very well, the top 15 agricultural products that are imported. But the top 5 include processed foods, which are usually very high in sodium, calorific value, oils and fats, wheat, rice, and meat and maize. And what do they all supply, essentially? Protein. Biological diversity. Now you sort of create a quadrant that shows countries that are biodiversity reserve countries, meaning that they have nature to drive development, and those that import food. So Bahamas, for example, has a lot of nature left in its jurisdiction, but imports a lot of food. Bahamas does less agriculture and has basically shifted its income generation activities to tourism. Suriname and Guyana have a lot of nature left, but they spend a lot less on food importation. That's because they are net producers of food. And then we have countries that are in deficit in terms of biocapacity and nature. Those that spend a lot on food are Antigua and Barbados, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, and comparatively less Grenada, St. Lucia, Belize, Jamaica and Haiti. And the measures that are used to distinguish them are in the box on the right. 1.7 global hectares per person is used because that's the global average. And when we look in terms of expenditure on food per capita, in some countries it's over $1,200 per person per year, and in other countries it's as low as $100. We do have in the CARICOM Secretariat and across the community a wide range of policies, strategies and plans that capture the aspirations of the political leadership as well as the people of the region and present to the people of the region solutions to existing problems. So there's a regional food and nutrition security policy, fairly recent. There's a common fisheries policy. There's an agricultural policy. And of course there's a human resource development and authority strategy. And all of these are contributing to helping CARICOM meet its own strategic objectives in a strategic plan that goes until 2019. So when you read these documents, you have a sense that CARICOM understands the problem facing the region. Now, I'm coming to an end. So what about the opportunities? The first one is, given that we do have some countries that are biocapacity rich or biocapacity reserve countries, then we need to promote and support biodiversity conservation as well as import replacement in those areas, particularly in the Guyana Shield where we have Guyana and Suriname. or in the Mesoamerica area where we have Belize. Here, because at least of the connectivity between Guyana and Suriname, we can utilize an area-wide approach to conserve biodiversity across borders. Because as we saw before in the definition of an ecosystem, political borders do not matter. An organism will not stop for a visa or a passport to cross over in a habitat. Small-scale family farms actually produce up to 70% of what we eat in the region. And we do need to place a lot of emphasis on supporting farming at that level. Of the top food imports that I showed in the slide, $2 billion are spent per year, or 46% of all imports. And these family farms and nature provide a large and wide range of genetic material that can be used even in a changing climate. When you think in terms of cassava, there's enough genetic elasticity in the region to meet any impact caused by climate change, whether it's concentrated higher levels of CO2, higher temperatures, or whatever, or new pests and diseases. There's enough diversity, and that's an important staple. It's good to see Barbados using the cassava flour in many different tasty dishes. And this will help us replace a number of these imported foods that are contributing to unwellness. Is that a word? In the region. It's not a word. To NCDs.
But you know that.
Yes. To NCDs. It explains, for example, food and nutrition related causes explain about 65% of the NCD problem we have in the region. And that's a food-based issue, a diet-based issue. We can promote and support cultural and marine-based tourism in biodiversity deficit areas. The biodiversity deficit areas happen to be Caribbean islands, which have huge marine spaces that are underutilized. And so we can support cultural tourism there, as well as achieve some of the marine-based area targets for the Biodiversity Convention, such as the 10% marine area conserved. We have seen, for example, and why this is true for at least tourism, we've seen a shift, particularly in OECS, from agriculture contributing to the GDP to tourism actually taking that role, as high as 64% in Antigua and Barbuda. And quite recently, and Ms. Singh can always happy to explain what BBNJ means, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. These are areas that are outside national jurisdiction, and there's an opportunity here for mobilizing new partnerships and resources. There's a big meeting coming up later this year in September. We need new metrics to value and conserve biodiversity in ecosystems. One group of authors mentioned a global deal for nature on the scale of the Paris Agreement, that we need to really start focusing on how we can value and benefit from nature. GDP needs to be adjusted for nature. It's not just in terms of our built capital, but what's our natural capital as well. And we need to factor that into how we compute our value. When we use nature, we also need to have a national system of accounting for nature. It's not enough to just account for national budget and how we spend national budget, but also how we utilize nature. And we need to factor that into our national system of accounts. A universal framework that recognizes ecology, agriculture, and food systems. It's a complex. And we have to work together to make the invisible visible here. Because agriculture is believed to contribute 70% to the projected loss of terrestrial biodiversity globally. And so we need to take that into the picture. It's important to recognize the multidimensional nature of biodiversity in ecosystems and the interdependent roles they play in food and nutrition security. This is my second to last slide. And in that regard, harness the synergies in the various instruments at the international and regional levels in terms of cooperation. The 3 Rio Conventions, for example, have a lot in common, but require separate reporting and very often separate systems to implement them. And I believe there are great opportunities for countries to find ways to harness the synergies among these conventions. And so, because when you really look at it, we have a small number of experts in the region, and the same people you find at all 3 convention meetings. And it's time that we move in that direction. Given the multidimensional nature of the problems we face, we also need multidisciplinary approach to negotiating agreements or to reviewing them at all scales. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with this quote from a group of very important people who gathered 1 year after the Paris Agreement to examine how we could save planet Earth. And they said in part that the resource hunger of the human enterprise has become too large for our planet, and they took aim at the Paris Agreement. And it aims to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. What does this mean? It means ceasing fossil fuel use before 2050. That's what the post-2020 biodiversity target hopes to achieve, is increasing ecosystem and biodiversity conservation and living in harmony with nature. And all of that helping to improve human well-being. Happy International Biodiversity Day. Thank you very much.